Should I be sitting in the free chair? I know.
This is good. This is good. Trust me.
Okay.
Can you do one also?
Oh, I was even looking.
Okay. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you.
Getting all the angles.
Right, all the angles.
This is such a funny vibe for a photo. I love it. I know.
You good?
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. Well done.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to see if I can move this as close as I can. We're fine?
2 seconds delayed, but that's what it looks like.
Okay, great. Cool.
I'll pick you up on the other camera as soon as you start speaking.
Okay.
Which is across.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, good. All right. Should we get going?
Really? Hopefully it's a user error.
Hello, everybody. We can just take our seats. We're going to get started soon.
It really is. It's good, right?
All right. Take your time at the back, get coffee, snacks. All right, thank you guys. Good evening. Thank you all for coming and for tuning in from home and from abroad. Hi, Brooke and the Hofbauer family. It really is such a privilege to be able to speak to you tonight about what we all believe is a very important issue affecting Israeli politics and civilian life and our relationships to Israel here in the diaspora. Before we begin, I wanted to very quickly thank everyone from Beth Tzedek and the IPF team who've been working behind the scenes very diligently to make this happen tonight. So let's all give them a round of applause. Thank you, everybody. So my name is Kyle Brill. I grew up here in Toronto attending Beth Tzedek, and I'm very thrilled to be part of its next chapter, working to help foster new relationships with outstanding organizations like IPF Atid. Last year, I was honored to be selected as a member of IPF Atid's Charles Bronfman conveners cohort, it's a bit of a mouthful, a distinguished group of professionals from across IPF's chapters committed to a two-state outcome to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I also have the distinct pleasure of serving on the steering committee for IPF Atid's Toronto chapter. Professionally, I work in real estate development, focusing on purpose-built rental and student rental projects across the GTA and Southern Ontario. I'm a trained architect and urban designer, and I've maintained a consistent interest in geopolitics in the Middle East throughout much of my life. This interest persisted through my architectural master's thesis, which I completed at the University of Waterloo in 2016. That thesis, States of Dependency, Infrastructures of the Common, was the inspiration and impetus for tonight's conversation. The thesis examined how urban design in Jerusalem is influenced by the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, exploring the connection that urban development has with statecraft and conflict management. The work focused on the spatial strategies and development patterns that emerged as a result of the conflict, and speculated on possible spatial interventions that could enable productive social engagement between both sides. The notion that urban design could be a means to facilitate societal change is still central to what I do today. I simply believe that what and how we build influences the character of our society. During my research, my main position was that the lived experiences of Israelis and Palestinians shape perceptions of the other on both sides of the conflict. These experiences are, in turn, mediated by the distinct built environments that both groups occupy. As a result, the feasibility of a two-state outcome and the diplomatic processes that govern it seem intimately connected to the physical development and use of this interwoven territory. I would go so far as to say that the success and viability of each state is inherently dependent on the other, i.e. states of dependency. There's a reason for the name of the talk. Israel's future cannot be separated from the Palestinian national narrative, and vice versa. So tonight, we will explore the challenges of implementing policies of separation, which are central to Israel's security and political future, on the ground in the built world. You may be wondering why this is an important topic to discuss at all, given all the other issues happening right now in Israel, the broader Middle East, here at home with Trump and tariffs and all sorts of crazy trade war dynamics. But what I will wager is that for most, if not everyone in this audience, cares just a little bit about the future of Israel, its security, and the character of its society. All of this is really wrapped up in the urban development of East Jerusalem and West Bank, or in other words, the issues of settlements. The proliferation and evolution of the settlement movement under pretenses of security is ironically one of the largest roadblocks to maintaining the nature of Israel as a Jewish, democratic, and secure state, which are the fundamental goals of Zionism, issues that our guest Alex will be delving into shortly. And with that fantastic segue, it's my pleasure to introduce Alex Lederman to you all. Alex Lederman is IPF Senior Policy and Communications Associate and an expert source of knowledge on Israeli politics, policy, and the broader Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I'm really thrilled he was able to join us this evening for this talk. Alex has written extensively on the issues of West Bank settlements and will bring his expertise to bear in this conversation, to be sure. As a note on the format tonight, Alex will give a bit of an introduction on the context through the lens of prevailing policy, political considerations, and military strategy. And then I'll work to give a bit of a contextual background on these issues through the lens of urbanism. And in so doing, our goal is to expand an understanding of this topic and really get down to why it's such a central issue to solve. But to keep Alex and I in check tonight, to make sure we don't get carried away, our conversation is going to be moderated by Miri Teich, a fellow member of IPF Atid Toronto and steering committee co-chair. Miri has a Master of Public Policy in Conflict Resolution and Mediation from Tel Aviv University and is currently working on a Master's of Architecture at U of T Daniels School of Architecture. Miri's unique background makes her the perfect mediator for this topic. So without further ado, let's dive right in. Miri, want to take us away?
Yes.
Let's get going.
Thank you for doing my job in part for me and introducing both of us. So yeah, like you said, to set up kind of the context, you're going to be giving the urbanism spiel, and then we have Alex to give the policy spiel. So I thought we would start with Alex since you just spoke. And Alex, I think it would be really helpful if you could kind of set the stage for everyone and maybe provide a brief introduction on policy in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, kind of the history, how we've gotten to the present moment. Yeah, that'd be helpful.
Sure, thanks so much. I'm going to go over here so that I can refer to the maps that are up on the screen. Hi, everyone. Can you guys hear me? Thanks so much for having me. Thank you so much for coming. It's always a pleasure to be back in Toronto. It's one of my favorite cities that I get to travel to a fair amount for work for Israel Policy Forum. So thank you guys for having me. I'm going to do my best to give the briefest, most concise, and also the most substantive overview of the West Bank and its history without losing anyone and keeping everyone on the same page. So just bear with me. I'll do a quick overview, periodically look around to make sure that you guys are following, because I feel like with this topic, it's really important that we're all on the same page, because there are lots of geographic and political and historical terms when it comes to the West Bank that we need to understand that are relevant to our discussion today. And I'm going to do my best to ensure that we all have a solid basis there. So I'm just going to start off briefly by talking about this first map right here. You guys can see this cursor, right? This is going to be my little laser pointer. This is a map of Israel circa 1949, after the War of Independence. This should all be familiar to probably most of you, but if it's not familiar, that's also okay. Long story short, at the end of this war, Israel occupies these borders, which are an expansion of the borders that were allocated to it under the original UN partition plan, which of course never came to fruition. The Jews said yes, the Arabs said no, the old story. At the end of this war, of course, this line right here and this line right here came into existence. This is when the territory that formerly was the British Mandate for Palestine became divided between this yellow area, which was the State of Israel, this area right here, which was occupied and annexed by the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, and this area right here, which was occupied by Egypt. This is what became known as the Gaza Strip, named after its largest city of Gaza, a very ancient city. And this territory became known as the West Bank, given that this right here is the Jordan River. This is the West Bank of the Jordan River relative to the Hashemite Kingdom on the East Bank. So this is when the territorial designation that became known as the West Bank That's when it came into existence. And now the reason why today we're talking about the West Bank and we're not talking about Gaza is because in Gaza, at least for the time being, there are no Israeli civilians. We're not talking about two peoples living entrenched in the same geographic territory. Despite, the war in Gaza, despite the fact that there's a military campaign going on there, the future of the territory is somewhat undetermined at the moment. We're not talking about two peoples living in the same geographical unit, whereas that is the reality in the West Bank and also in East Jerusalem, which is a related sphere that we're going to touch on. So this is the map up until 1967, when Israel fights a war again against all the Arab states that it had previously invaded it in 1948, and Israel comes to control the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, as well as the Golan Heights up here, which is not so relevant to our discussion, and the Sinai Peninsula over here, which it eventually gives back to Egypt, again, not so relevant for our discussion. So that's what created the reality that we're in today, where Israel controls all of the territory from the river to the sea, both its sovereign territory and these other areas that Israel did not declare sovereignty over, did not assert Israeli law over. And this is one of the fundamental questions determining Israel's future today, and one of the questions that Israel's leaders faced after the victory in 1967, what to do with these new territories. Are we going to entrench our presence there in order to determine the outcome in one way or the other? Are we going to trade these territories to our enemies in exchange for peace? Are we going to do some sort of mixture of both? What are the considerations that are guiding our approach to this area? So that takes us to the next map, which is the Alon plan. So, as I mentioned, all of this territory here, Israel occupied since 1967, did not declare sovereignty over. I do want to mention, though, that the West Bank is, of course, an area of immense historical and religious and national significance to the Jewish people. This is something that is often cited as a key consideration in how Israel should approach the West Bank going forward. I think that it's an important thing to acknowledge that there is a legitimate Jewish claim to the West Bank. Just as that you could argue that there's a legitimate Palestinian claim to cities within what are currently the state of Israel. I personally think that there are other considerations that need to be taken into account as well as the religious and historical claims to the West Bank. But it's important to acknowledge that this is not a territory that Israel is has a presence in for no reason. And by and large, when we're talking about Israel's policies in the West Bank, there really are two different types of considerations that have motivated them over the years. One consideration is ideological, what I mentioned earlier, the deep religious, historical ties that the Jewish people have to the West Bank, and also, the religious Zionist idea that there's some sort of redemption that is going to be preempted by the realization of sovereignty of Jewish presence throughout the entire land of Israel. These are the ideological considerations. Then there are, of course, the security considerations and the political considerations. Things like, we need to hold on to this territory because if we don't hold on to it, our enemies are going to use it to attack us. Or we need to trade this territory back to our enemies in exchange for peace. So this is the dance that Israel has kind of been in since 1967. And we could see the labor governments from 1967 until, or basically for the next decade until 1977, the labor governments prioritized the ideological, or the security concerns over the ideological ones primarily. And this plan was created by Yigal Allon, who was a prominent minister in the labor governments of Israel in the late 60s and early 70s. He basically created this model whereby Israel designated these purple areas here as areas where it is in the interest of the state of Israel to have to work towards a permanent presence by encouraging civilian settlement there, namely the Jordan Valley here and the area around Jerusalem. If you notice here, the ascent into Jerusalem is very narrow and could easily be cut off. And this was just a strategic challenge for the state of Israel before the Six-Day War. So the idea was we want to expand the area around Jerusalem. And you can also see here, this black line is a map of the Jerusalem municipality, which was annexed by Israel after 1967. So already we're expanding the area around Jerusalem, and Israel decided that it was in its national interest to ensure that there was a Jewish majority in this area around Jerusalem. And this, to a large extent, has been realized in the decades since, and we'll look at some maps of that later. Whereas this green area is an area with a strong Arab majority, strong Palestinian majority. This is where all of the major Palestinian cities are. And the Labour governments looked at this area and said, we can't feasibly do anything to change the demographic balance in this area. We're not going to encourage Jewish settlement in this area. And instead, we're going to hold on to it in hopes that we can exchange it to back to Jordan for peace, or maybe create some sort of autonomous Palestinian polity. But this is one of the ways in which the early settlement policy was tailored in order to suit the security considerations of the time. And many of the first settlements were here in the Jordan Valley. They were secular. They were liberal Zionist kibbutzim. They were agricultural in nature, and many of them today, I mean, these are very, very small communities. The vast minority of settlers live here, but their orientation tends to be more left-wing relative to the settlements that are in the ideological or in the biblical heartland of the West Bank along the mountain ridge where the major Palestinian cities are. You with me? Okay. Just going to briefly touch on a few more points. So, okay, actually one thing that I will say before we move on, after the Labour governments fell with Menachem Begin's rise to power in the late 70s, this was a major upheaval in Israeli politics when the right finally took control in Israel after decades of domination by the center-left, by the Ashkenazi secular elite. They threw out this plan and created a new plan whereby Israel would there are several different iterations of the plan, but the summary is that Israel essentially would try to break up the Palestinian dominance over the central mountain ridge, this strategic area running north-south, connecting the Palestinian cities along Route 60, Jenin, Nablus, Ramallah, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Hebron. And that's when we really start to see an uptick in the ideological, religiously motivated settlers moving to this mountain ridge of the West Bank. As opposed to just the area around Jerusalem and the Jordan Valley. And also since the late 60s, there also was a Jewish presence in the city of Hebron, which is a different consideration entirely. But again, one motivated by more the ideological side rather than the security side. So that brings us, again, we're rushing through this, but that brings us to the Oslo Accords when Israel decides that it is going to initiate a diplomatic process with the Palestine Liberation Organization, mutual recognition in exchange for the creation of a Palestinian autonomous entity in the West Bank that essentially was understood would be a state in the making. The idea that Israel was going to achieve peace by allowing for the eventual creation of a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. This created the Palestinian Authority, and it created this fragmented model that we see today, which is what governs the political reality on the ground in the West Bank. The Oslo process created three different areas of control in the West Bank. You have, I'll go in reverse order, Area C, which is all this white area over here, and also this green, by the way. This is area that remained under direct Israeli military occupation. It's the area that contains all of the West Bank settlements. That is these purple dots all throughout here. Then you have Area A, which are the major Palestinian cities. That is this area here in brown. This is where the plurality of the Palestinian population is in the West Bank. Today there are about 3 million or so Palestinians who live in the West Bank, as well as 500,000 Jews. And then you have Area B, which is a hybrid regime whereby the Palestinian Authority is responsible for civil control, like things like education and picking up trash on the streets and managing the day-to-day lives of the people. But the IDF is responsible for maintaining security. Under the Oslo Accords, the IDF is actually not allowed to go into the cities of Area A, this brown area, where the Palestinian Authority security forces are responsible for maintaining security. This, of course, in practice, has fallen by the wayside to some extent because the IDF actually regularly now does operate in the heart of the Palestinian cities. So this is the reality that was created, intended to be a temporary situation in the 1990s. Obviously, the final status agreements where Israel attempted to allow for the creation of a Palestinian state fell apart when the Palestinians were presented with various offers in the late 90s and then later in the 2000s and the early 2010s, all of which were rejected by the PLO. And we've essentially been frozen in this reality ever since, where you essentially have two systems, two populations layered on top of each other in the West Bank that operate under different laws and operate under different, it really feels like two countries layered on top of each other. Because if you go into, a city like Ramallah, which is the de facto capital of the Palestinian Authority, it doesn't feel like you're in Israel. It's Arabic signs on the street and, no indication that you are in an area where Israel is the dominant national authority. Not even in Arab cities in Israel, where you still, to some extent, feel like you are in Israel. Whereas when you go into the West Bank settlements, these really function as islands of Israel within the West Bank, under this kind of temporary situation where Israel doesn't formally recognize its own sovereignty over the West Bank. What allows Israeli law to work in the settlements are these temporary regulations that are renewed every 5 years. So it's a very complex system. It's one that kind of developed through this temporary process that was never finished, and that's one of the reasons why the situation is as complicated as it is now. So when we're talking about the West Bank settlements, this is something that is often thrown around as a blanket term, and I think people kind of think that all settlements are qualitatively the same, but there are some key differences that distinguish types of settlements. One of them is the location in the West Bank. If you notice, there's this red line right here. This is the West Bank security barrier. Not all of it has been built, but a large part of it has. This was constructed in the early 2000s amid the Second Intifada, when there were waves of terror attacks. It was built to essentially keep Israeli civilians safe and prevent the free movement of Palestinians from the West Bank into Israel and into the major settlement blocks. So there's a distinction between most of the settlement population, which lives west of this barrier, attached by this barrier to Israel, which is over here, and settlements that are east of the block. These settlements, which have a far larger footprint geographically throughout the West Bank, but are a minority of the settlement population. And we can see that illustrated here. These are the settlements distributed by size. We can see that the majority of all the settlements over 20,000 people are located west of the barrier. The major settlements like Ma'ale Adumim, Modi'in Illit, Beitar Illit, you have Ariel, which is the fourth largest. This is the one that's deepest in the West Bank. But all these other ones, the settlements that, feasibly, when we're talking about drawing a border between Israel and the Palestinians, most of the settlers can be very easily incorporated into the state of Israel with minor land swaps. So this is also important to keep in mind. The settlement movement has largely failed in achieving its goal of establishing territorial dominance consistently throughout this territory. Because as I mentioned earlier, you still have these major Palestinian cities running north-south. Palestinians have an overwhelming demographic dominance throughout most of this territory. And I think that's important to keep in mind because, yes, settlements pose a barrier when we're talking about the possibility of separation, of drawing a border between Israel and the Palestinians, but they don't create, we have not yet reached a point of no return where we're going to have to carry out some sort of evacuation of 500,000 people in order to draw that border. Again, this is setting aside the political considerations, the other security considerations. When we're just looking at it as, logistically speaking, where do you draw the border? It's not very difficult to imagine where you could draw a border here based on the distribution of the population. This is East Jerusalem. I'm going to set that aside for a second. This is a proposal from 2020. I'm not necessarily endorsing it. There are some things that I don't like about it, namely the fact that it proposes annexing the Gaza envelope communities that were invaded on October 7th to a state of Palestine. Again, I'm not endorsing it, but it does show that, under this proposal, with very minor land swaps, you're incorporating close to 80% of the settler population. So it can be done. The issue is the political feasibility and the fact that there is no, from the Israeli perspective, there's no Palestinian partner that is willing to actually accept Israel's existence and account for its legitimate security concerns under this sort of outcome. So that is one of the challenges that we are currently in today. But the alternative, you have two national groups between the river and the sea, roughly equal in size. Either you move in the direction of separation, advancing this as a long-term goal, even if it's not possible for the foreseeable future, or you go in the direction that Israel's currently going in under the current government, where it is actively working to entrench Israel's presence throughout the West Bank and potentially Gaza as well, and create a reality where you have two peoples roughly equal in size that are in one state, and that state is either going to be Jewish or it's either going to be democratic, but mathematically speaking, it can't be both. So that is the conundrum that Israel is in right now. And I'll set aside, I do want to touch on Jerusalem very, very briefly, and then I'll turn it over to Kyle, because I know I've spoken a lot. Jerusalem is kind of a unique situation because, as I mentioned, all of this area here, this was part of Jordan until 1967. Israel conquered this along with the West Bank, which is kind of all around here. It expanded the Jerusalem municipality to include all of this area, and it applied Israeli law. So that's the difference between East Jerusalem and the West Bank. East Jerusalem, under Israeli sovereignty, according to Israel. The West Bank, not under Israeli sovereignty. And we saw Israel, in a similar way to the West Bank, try to advance its aims by creating Jewish communities in the territory that had conquered. So it built these neighborhoods, first of all here, kind of locking in this enclave to West Jerusalem, and here, it built neighborhoods down on the south, in the northeast of Jerusalem, basically trying to entrench Israel's presence demographically in this area and dictate any sort of future outcome and prevent it from easily being handed over to the Jordanians or a Palestinian polity in the future. But the key distinction between these communities here, which many of the international community considers them settlements, but under Israeli law, they are under Israeli law, unlike settlements in the West Bank, which again are not under Israeli sovereignty. And here we can see this map in a bit greater detail, but it's not as relevant for our conversation. I know this is not the Q&A, but any burning questions about anything that I just said? Anything clarifying before we move on? Okay. Yes. Yeah.
There's some areas
Mm-hmm. Yes. This is a great question. This is actually one of the weird paradoxes about Jerusalem, is that you have areas here, namely, this is Kafar al-Aqab, and over here, this is the Shalfat refugee camp. When Israel built the barrier in the early 2000s, it excluded some neighborhoods of Jerusalem that Israel itself recognizes as under its sovereignty. But because these are areas that are under Israeli sovereignty, the PA, the Palestinian Authority, can't legally operate there. So these areas have effectively become no man's land. And Israel says, on the one hand, Jerusalem is our united capital, but on the other, Israel itself divided Jerusalem, what it considers Jerusalem, when it built this separation barrier here, because these are areas that Israel doesn't really want to manage. There are, a lot of terror has historically emanated from these areas. There are communities that are difficult to police that Israel kind of just didn't want to deal with, and the Jerusalem municipality has neglected. And the construction of the security barrier in this way has essentially exacerbated that problem, given that there's basically no law enforcement in these communities. And even on an issue like building codes, their building codes are not enforced. A lot of unsafe structures. It's really kind of a lawless no man's land, and it's a really significant area. So in my view, Israel should either exercise its sovereignty in these areas if it views them as sovereign, or it should relinquish sovereignty over them if it doesn't actually want to assume the responsibility for governing. But really excellent question. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Kyle now because I feel like I've spoken for quite a while.
All right. So that was a lot of information, and it was a great introduction to the context that we're dealing with here. And let's just scroll down here a little bit, get to my slides. Yeah, so building off of that fantastic introduction, I really wanted to begin to sketch out the world that we're diving into on the ground. When we think of Jerusalem, when we think of the West Bank, or otherwise known as Judea and Samaria, many of us think of this image in particular. It's Jerusalem, the ancient and biblical city that's significant to all three Abrahamic faiths. It hosts several important religious sites, including, of course, the most significant in Judaism, the Western Wall. Bear with me here. And the surrounding Judean desert, or the West Bank, is and has been the backdrop to countless biblical narratives. And these are places that are really, as Alex touched on, are really deeply rooted in Jewish cultural mythology and are the sites of some of the oldest stories in our history. The Jewish story is very strongly tied to these places. It's something that we really can't ignore. And in many ways, the modern state of Israel has sought to tie back to these key sites and these landscapes to reposition them in the continuum of the Jewish story. And to build anything here, despite all of the policy considerations, is deeply complicated. And that is to say nothing of the whole Palestinian dimension at all. But things do get built here nonetheless. And if we travel back to 1967, after the Six-Day War, Israel, for the first time, gained control over these historically and culturally significant sites of East Jerusalem and the biblical hinterland of Judea and Samaria. And this naturally began to influence the national narrative of the Israeli state. The development of these territories became intimately tied to the process of state building. New construction was intended to connect modern Israel to its biblical origins and became a way of projecting permanence, continuity, and claim. So what we're seeing in this image here is the settlement of Gilo, which was built in 1971, surrounding East Jerusalem. And this image here is Ma'ale Adumim, as Alex already mentioned, which was built in 1975. And these were both planned and constructed within a decade of the Six-Day War, and they were built to appear as if they had always been there. The use of iconic Jerusalem stone and terraced building forms really deeply rooted into the landscape were strategies employed to maximize this very visceral connection to the past. At the same time, this approach would be intimately coupled with military and security concerns. There we go. Too many pages. So during the Six-Day War, and what we're seeing on the screen here, Ariel Sharon, who was at the time a prominent general of the Sinai Command, developed the tactic of defense in depth in the Sinai Peninsula, which we're seeing here. And this strategy involved capturing and defending multiple strategic points across a territory as opposed to holding a single line, and that reduced vulnerability to single-point defensive breaches in the territory. And so this concept remained relevant after the war, as similar principles were applied to settlement plans surrounding Jerusalem. And this is a very significant map, because as I mentioned, if the military controlled this point, it lost it, it can simply retreat to another over here and recapture it if need be. And this kind of logic, what we'll see in the next image, this kind of logic was laid out for the settlement map of the Jerusalem region after 1967. And so what we're looking at here is a sort of an official planning document to anyone who's interested in urban planning and development. It's really a kind of a growth plan or a map that identifies areas where new construction could take place. But these locations were indeed planned with military considerations as a defensive frontier, similar to Ariel Sharon's Sinai plan, but against the Kingdom of Jordan to the east, and employed the same logic that we saw before. So really, it was creating a sort of defensive matrix against any sort of future invasion from the Kingdom of Jordan. But this plan only laid out a framework, and over time, these communities were built out, stretched on hilltops throughout the Judean desert. So that's Ma'ale Adumim today. And that's Pisgat Zev, which is another settlement in the East Jerusalem envelope. And around 240,000 people live in these new communities surrounding East Jerusalem alone. And there are even more spread out further into the West Bank, such as Har Homa, which is, again, technically part of the East Jerusalem area, built in 1991. And these settlements are established. We have to remember that these settlements are established on militarily conquered and technically disputed land. The East Jerusalem settlements are a bit of a different story, as Alex has already detailed. But the final status of the West Bank is yet to be determined, broadly speaking. But these places function indisputably as part of Israel. And this paradox is really reflective of the strategy that was adopted by the military in the post-Six Day War context, which was creating these facts on the ground, or in other words, using physical settlements and their integration within Israeli-controlled territory to help shape future border negotiations. And so when we view these images, you may also notice that these communities are all built on hilltops. And if you know anything about construction, building a community in this way is not simple. But the approach makes sense when we remember that this territory was anything but vacant. The valleys between these hills, which are more suitable for construction and agriculture, are the sites of many Palestinian communities and were part of Jordan up until 1967. So after 1967, the territorial picture became Israeli-controlled urban centers on the hilltops and Palestinian communities in the valleys. And so when we further draw on that military logic, the outward-facing design of the homes was intended to create clear observation lines across the territory. And when this approach was initially conceived, you look inside Har Homa, you can see how much of a commanding presence it has over that landscape. You can see very far into the distance. And that strategy made a lot of sense when it was initially conceived, because it was a natural advantage to monitor troop movements, again, from Jordan in the event of a future war, if a future war would break out. But however, today, Jordan really isn't the principal threat. They're actually a major security partner with Israel. And the concerns have largely shifted to local Palestinian populations that are dispersed in those valleys in between these settlements. And while the modern settlement movement will argue that the presence of these settlements improves security, the central tenet of a two-state outcome really is the effective separation of Israeli and Palestinian populations, which Alex touched on very well in his introduction. And this image here is of Gush Etzion. It's actually it's another settlement again in the West Bank, but close to Jerusalem. And this is the old military watch post, which was the center of the original community. And this separation, which again you can kind of see quite well here with the Gush Etzion in the front and Palestinian communities in the valleys behind, this separation is really necessary for national security and for population balance, which Alex has already touched on, and because it ensures Israel remains a country with a Jewish majority demographically. But again, this interwoven settlement pattern poses real challenges to realizing this goal of functional separation, especially when the landscape and many significant sites in the region are important to both Israelis and Palestinians. So this in turn really necessitates the development of infrastructures of separation. So these are more photos of some of those settlements. It really demands the construction of infrastructures of separation, including the separation barrier, a network of checkpoints that determine access to key locations, not the least of which being Jerusalem. So these are some examples of that separation barrier as it runs around the West Bank. And this is a photo here of what you would encounter if you were to try to enter Area A. It's actually illegal to enter Area A if you are Israeli. It's a risk to your life, as they say on the sign. And if we return to Jerusalem for a moment, it really has become a microcosm of a lot of these issues. And this is a sort of a zoomed in example of the Kalandia checkpoint and its territorial setup, which Alex was actually discussing before I took the mic. It's incredibly important because it acts as the only access point that Palestinians have into Jerusalem from Ramallah, but it's the principal connection directly into the city, and it separates, along with the Highway 60 route, which Alex also mentioned, that connects all of those Palestinian municipalities. It separates what would otherwise be one urban area. And it makes it very difficult for Palestinians to access Jerusalem for both security and symbolic reasons, in that the Israeli government was trying to shift Palestinian movement patterns to associate Ramallah as the primary capital of the Palestinian Authority, as opposed to their claim of East Jerusalem. And if we look at that checkpoint, again, on the ground, it's a very challenging landscape, sort of littered with barriers, cars, and as you walk through, what you encounter is this quite oppressive and challenging series of checkpoints and security controls. This is a picture from inside the turnstile, but many people would say that this is absolutely 100% necessary for Israel's security interests to be maintained. And so if we look at the broader map of the Jerusalem area, while it's technically reunified as the capital of the Jewish state, the reality is that it doesn't function as one single city or one single urban area. It's really an agglomeration of all of these different ethnic communities and enclaves that are dispersed across a very mountainous and desert terrain, and they're crisscrossed by old border lines, disputed territories, and checkpoints. And so Kalandia is up here, by the way. So this is that community of Kfar Aqab that Alex mentioned, and it's contrasted by the Himza checkpoint, which is an exclusively Israeli checkpoint, which is effectively just a gap in the separation barrier, and you can drive right through it like many other highway checks that you would encounter here in North America. But these layered borders and these disputed territories are so complex that old border lines sometimes cross through streets and homes, and so many people actually talk about, oh, well, why don't we go back to the old border lines of 1948 or the border lines of 1967 to really get into or advance the peace process. And what this image is really depicting is that some of those border lines, this is the armistice line from 1949, cut right through people's homes and right through streets and infrastructure. And so it's a really difficult thing to try to detach or to move back to what was established previously or historically. So we have to think more creatively and more innovatively about these issues, and we have to consider how things exist on the ground when we're coming up with policy. And so with all that covered, really, where do we go here? I think we should let Miri open the mic up to some questions for Alex and I, and we can continue the conversation. So that's the introduction to this. It's quite a lot of material.
Long introduction. Can you guys hear me? Yeah, okay. So yeah, I thought we would have a little back and forth. I prepared questions, and then we can turn it to the audience. So I guess turning back to you, Alex, something that Kyle was touching on a lot was security, and one of the biggest challenges to shared space being security. Obviously, many Israelis feel safer with separation, and many Palestinians feel that checkpoints and barriers are oppressive. Can you speak a little bit about this dual narrative and how this has developed over time? And is there a compromise between security and accessibility?
Definitely, it's a great question. I think that when we're talking about separation, and when we're talking about separation and security, there are really two ways of thinking about it. And from an Israeli perspective, from the perspective of Israel's national interest, there are two ways about thinking about separation. So, for instance, when we look at the West Bank today, there is separation in the sense that the populations live separately, and there's separate infrastructure for both populations. And on the one hand, that serves Israel's security interests because, if you are an Israeli and you're afraid of the potential for a Palestinian terror attack, it benefits you to have a separate road that you don't have to drive on. That's one of the reasons why, there's one specific community in the West Bank that many have paid attention to in recent years called Hawara, where it was notable because the road that many settlers required to access their communities required them to drive straight through this Palestinian community. And it was often the site of Palestinian terror attacks as well as acts of violence committed by West Bank settlers themselves against Palestinians. It was really just an area of friction. And Israel's response was to create a bypass road, which of course solves the immediate problem of the populations being enmeshed and that creating friction and creating violence when you have Israelis and Palestinians driving on the same road. But zooming out, when we're talking about separation and even having separate infrastructure for the populations in the West Bank, that doesn't solve the greater existential challenge of the fact that Israel's civilian presence in the West Bank is an existential threat to Israel's character as a Jewish and democratic state. And when we're talking about separation, we need to think about how we create separate geographic contiguous polities in the long term, even if the Palestinian state can't be created today. That's not something that I think anyone is credibly proposing. But it also isn't in Israel's security interest to have a civilian population living in a territory where there is another national group that, largely speaking, doesn't want them to be there, and these two peoples don't want to cohabitate in the same geographic space, which is what necessitates the reality of separation, of actual physical separation. Now, I also think that one of the problems that is created by this separation is there isn't interaction between the peoples, and one of the not the only reason, maybe not even the primary reason, but I think one reason why we've seen Israelis move to the right even before October 7th, since the Second Intifada and since the Oslo process, is the fact that there aren't day-to-day interactions between Israelis and Palestinians on the ground. And most settlers live their entire lives. I mean, some of them, have Palestinians who work in the settlements, and there is some interaction, but it's much more limited. And especially Israelis who live in sovereign Israel within the Green Line, most of them have never met a Palestinian in their life, and the Palestinians they do meet they do encounter are, terrorists they see on their TV screens or read about in the media or see on social media. So this is another problem, and it's one of the conundrums here when we're talking about separation is, in order to create a better reality on the ground, in order to talk about peace, you actually have to have interaction between the two peoples, while at the same time creating a reality where they can have an amicable divorce. Because from my perspective, there's no situation here in which this conflict is resolved by a marriage.
I guess I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, Kyle, because I've read your thesis. And
Wow.
I know, this conversation's a little different because you were talking about Jerusalem mostly, but you were proposing a commons-based approach, which is basically, in short, you're advocating for spatial mixing. And it left me wondering if that was, antithetical to a two-state solution in some way, where we emphasize separation mostly. So how do you kind of reconcile that, and what's the difference?
Yeah, it's really a difficult context to unravel. I think in the case of Jerusalem, it's this unique context where it's significant to both Israelis and Palestinians, and it's very hard to functionally allow it to exist as a city solely for one side or the other. And it's going to be very hard to split it if in the event that there was going to be a Palestinian capital in East Jerusalem, which I don't think is a very likely outcome. Given in today's context, it would be very difficult to split. I mean, you can see on the screen here, like creating a border within a complex city like this is quite challenging. But when you look at the West Bank, it's almost, again, it's the imperative of maintaining Israel as a secure Jewish and democratic state is to have these separate communities. So I don't have a very comprehensive or good answer to that question, in the sense that I think spatial mixing within the West Bank context would from an urban design perspective, would create a more positive outcome, or would reduce instances of terror attacks. I think while it may help improve the perception of the other, right? Like Alex was mentioning, there's Israelis that have never met a Palestinian, and there's Palestinians who have never met an Israeli. And what I said in the introduction to tonight's talk was that the perceptions that Israelis and Palestinians have of each other is really fundamentally rooted in their day-to-day lives and what they experience, how they experience the territory they both occupy, how they move through that territory, whether it's through a checkpoint, whether it's on an Israeli-controlled highway. So notions of speed, notions of slowness, like how you actually move through this shared space. And what that means to somebody, access to religious sites, these sorts of questions. Those questions shape how Israelis and Palestinians feel and think about each other. And so while I think no one's leaping towards the opportunity to say, let's create some shared or mixed cities in the West Bank where Israelis and Palestinians can interact, or shared sites. I think if there was some notion of social cooperation, some chance for the other side to understand each other through in this environment, it could lead to some other dialogues emerging. Because I think fundamentally, if we keep going down the road we're going, it's going to be very hard to, I think, functionally maintain a Palestinian sovereign entity in the West Bank if Israel was to annex more territory, keep up with the settlement expansion. And then if Israel annexes that territory, then, as Alex had brought up earlier, the notion of Israel as being Jewish and democratic wouldn't be possible. So that's a very difficult, that's a very roundabout way of answering maybe something you asked.
No, it was good, but you're just starting to scare me is all. But like, it's a question for Alex. Where are we going, Alex? I guess, you laid out all the possible futures of settlement expansion. So what are the possible, paths forward?
So I think that oftentimes when we're talking about the West Bank, people think, are we going to have two state? Are we going to have one state? What is the quote unquote solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? And I think that, especially when we're talking about what's going on right now, that's often not the best framing. I think it really should be framed as, are we heading towards annexation or are we heading towards separation? And this is something that Yair Golan, who is the leader of the Democrats Party in Israel, talks about, I think, in a very smart way, which is right now, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, Israel's government, specifically the parties on the far right, the parties of Bezalel Smotrich, and specifically Smotrich, but also Itamar Ben-Gvir fits in with this ideological bent. Their goal is to create a situation in which Israel is not only militarily dominant, which of course it is in the West Bank, but also demographically dominant, where Israel is the demographic majority throughout the entire territory. Now, the way to do that is either to expand settlements and put them in strategic locations to break up the Palestinian contiguity that, as I mentioned earlier, by and large still exists along Route 60, along that spine, the strategic spine of the mountain ridge of the West Bank. Or the other option, obviously, is to encourage voluntary or involuntary emigration of Palestinians out of the territory, which is an idea that, of course, goes back to Meir Kahane and the Kahanist movement. So I think that either we go down that path. That is also the illusion of the status quo, by the way, that predates the current Israeli government. Even if we go back to the 2000s, the 2010s, when Netanyahu has been in power this entire time, we've seen Israel slide towards creeping annexation of the West Bank with the expansion of settlements, and also the delegitimizing of the Palestinian Authority and the weakening of the Palestinian Authority, which was created to be this body that would be a Palestinian state in the making. And there are tons of issues with the Palestinian Authority. It's corrupt. It's, it is complicit in terrorism in some ways. We actually have a whole report at Israel Policy Forum that we published about 2 weeks ago that go into very specific details about how to reform the PA, but that's a whole nother topic. But in any case, Netanyahu chose to delegitimize the PA, and in doing so signal to the Palestinians that the idea that their self-interest was going to be advanced via negotiations was not true. And that's one of the reasons why, the converse of that was the strengthening of Hamas, which I think you can draw a direct line more or less to October 7th. But I think that, there's one other thing that I want to say about separation, and building off of what Kyle said earlier, which I think was really excellent. Separation is not a sexy thing to talk about. Like, it isn't, especially to us in the West, in our liberal sensibilities, liberal with a lowercase L sensibilities. The idea that there are two national or religious or ethnic groups that simply can't exist in the same idea goes against, a basic tenet of our society, which is based on this idea of pluralism and multiculturalism. And even within Israel, Israel is in many ways, for all of its faults, a liberal democracy. And you have multi-ethnic characteristics within the state of Israel. You have Jews and Arabs in many cases living side by side. But the simple reality of this conflict is that the lack of trust between the peoples and the fact that each people sees the other side as an existential threat necessitates separation as a step towards an eventual political resolution to the conflict, but also putting the peoples on equal footing, where they are no longer an existential threat to the other. And then I think we can talk about how to build people-to-people connections and talk about things like shared spaces and ideas for confederation that would bring Israelis and Palestinians together in a more tangible way on the ground. But I think that separation is a necessary step to get there.
Yeah, thank you. I guess given the challenges, though, to a two-state solution or full integration in this moment, I'm curious if there are urban planning solutions that can at least improve things on the ground, conditions for both people, while negotiations right now are kind of non-existent. And I guess that ties to a larger question that I've had this whole time, this whole topic, which is, we've been talking about how politics seem to shape urbanism. And, of course, what I've learned in school, is always to question, cities and settlements don't just appear overnight, maybe in the case of outposts, a little bit. But urbanism is, there's usually a government or a leadership or funds that are backing the development of a place. It doesn't just pop up out of nowhere. And yet, I think there's kind of a chicken and egg question to be asked here, because urbanism also shapes policy and spatial dynamics, and they influence the political reality between Israelis and Palestinians. So, I guess that wasn't a question, but I asked one earlier, how can urbanism, if it can, be leveraged in some way for good?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that point. I think it's really important to think about not whether or not urbanism as a discipline or urban design as a discipline can help solve these issues. We should consider how urban plans are conceived in this context. And so if you think about a place like Toronto, there's the planning department, there's the buildings department, there's urban design components to these sort of bureaucratic functions. But in the Israeli context, these settlements are conceived almost with another layer on top of them that isn't so banal. It's a military layer. It's a defensive layer. If we were planning all of our communities in Toronto to defend against an invasion from the United States, I think a lot of our communities would look very different. And so it's important to consider the context in which these decisions are made. I think if it's about demographic control, that's one question, right? So urbanism as a tool for establishing a certain demographic balance to ensure Israel stays as a predominantly Jewish state. I can kind of get that. When you start layering on that kind of tactical logic to it that I was trying to express with the Ariel Sharon plan in Sinai and kind of how that was translated into the West Bank settlement map around Jerusalem, it takes away, or at least I believe it draws away from all the positive elements of urban design. It puts them, it's like designing a sort of front of fortresses as opposed to trying to create, an actual functional, thriving city. And those communities that I showed some images of, I think I was particularly struck by Har Homa just because how prominent it sits in the landscape. But when you're inside of those communities, you don't really experience that position until you're at the top of it. So you see out across the entirety of its context. And we can't just, I think what I'm trying to get at here is you got to decouple the military logic from planning and from urban design, urbanism in this situation, which I think is going to be an extremely difficult thing to do, because I think it was actually a very clever thing that the Israeli government and military did in a post-1967 world where they had potential threats from invading armies that seemed to make a lot of sense, even though it was a little bit insidious, possibly, to use civilian populations as a kind of first front of defense. But we can't do that anymore in this context, because the dynamic has shifted to be about kind of managing Palestinian movement, managing their access to certain resources. There's a large aquifer under the Judean mountains that Israel maintains control over because of its settlement pattern. There's a variety of other considerations that kind of make any kind of discourse not that productive, because a Palestinian population can point the finger back at Israel and say, oh, you did X, Y, and Z, and then Israel will say, oh, well, you did A, B, C, and that's why I had to do X, Y, Z. So fundamentally, urbanism is a great tool to kind of start thinking about how populations want to interact. It's antithetical to military planning. And so you have to just, at a basic level, you have to decouple those concepts. So settlements plus security, I don't know if that's the right angle.
Yeah, just to add on to that, I think you brought up a great point, which is that the security rationale, by and large, for settlements is no longer relevant. And if anything, today, settlements have become a security liability. And that's one of the reasons why, when we're talking about Israel's presence in the West Bank, it's very important to make a distinction between the military presence and the civilian presence. Israel's military presence in the West Bank is a strategic necessity for the time being. There's no feasible reality in the next, couple years or even longer when Israel could withdraw its military from the West Bank. And I think anyone who thinks that is deluding themselves. But the fact that there are civilian communities living enmeshed within the Palestinian population that the IDF is tasked with defending is an enormous logistical, financial, military liability for the state of Israel. And this is, what we're seeing, even on the eve of October 7th, something like 2/3 to 3/4 of Israel's standing army was defending settlements in the West Bank and not defending Israel's borders, including the border with Gaza. And most of Israel's military presence in the West Bank is defending the settlements, not actually defending the state of Israel's, sovereign borders.
That was going to be my exact question. And I think it's going to be my last kind of question because I have more, but I don't want to be selfish, and I'm sure other people have questions. But just to put a point on it, Alex. Yes. Is this better? Okay.
The mics aren't the best.
I apologize. Okay, so to put more of a point on it, do you hear me? To put more of a point on it, Alex, how do Israeli settlements influence the feasibility of a two-state solution? You've already kind of said, but I'm curious, in recent events with current, what's currently going on, the Trump plan, etc., how much of a liability are they really? And then we'll turn to questions.
Sure, it's a great point. I think that people oftentimes reduce the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to be about settlements, which of course it isn't. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict would exist regardless of whatever is happening in the West Bank. It existed before 1967. It existed before 1948, before the West Bank even was conceived of as a territorial entity as we know it today. So I don't think that it's accurate to reduce the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to the West Bank and to settlements, which is why the conflict can't be solved today, keyword being today, by separation alone and by creating a Palestinian state and by negotiations. That's why we're in the situation we're in, is because the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is deeper than that. That being said, the settlement issue is one of the major, issues for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict because it will dictate the political future of the territory, and it is a tool that Israel has to essentially determine what that is going to be unilaterally. And that is one of the reasons why it is why it's such a challenge and why it does pose a barrier for any sort of future possibility in which there could be negotiations to determine the status of the territory. And I think that the settlement issue is one that is existentially significant for the future of the state of Israel because, as I said earlier, if you go down the path that Israel's currently going down, where you're working to increase the Israeli civilian presence throughout the West Bank, not just in the settlement blocks, but right now the Israeli government is approving settlement construction at a rate unlike anything we've ever seen. The Higher Planning Committee for the West Bank is meeting every week, whereas previously it met, every couple months. And the current Israeli government has also streamlined the approval process for settlements, whereas previously you needed, the approval of the defense minister at several different stages. Now the defense minister only has to approve once. So they're doing everything they can to expedite the creation of settlements, and also enable the proliferation of West Bank outposts, which are illegal under Israeli law, even though oftentimes they receive assistance from various government bodies and institutions. All of this is putting Israel down a path where the populations are so entrenched that you can't easily draw a border, and you're in a reality where you have de facto Israeli sovereignty throughout the entire territory, and a de facto one state that isn't a democracy if you have two peoples living under different systems of government. And that is not a given. Even under the current reality, without negotiations, it's possible to head down a different path that ensures and safeguards Israel's security.
Thanks. Do you have any last comments, Kyle,
Yeah.
before we go to questions?
I wanted to just add one point, and Alex touched on it a little bit. I think with the settlement expansion, Alex is very right to point out that it's not the settlement issue is not the key issue in the conflict. It's what it sets up, in the sense that it makes the argument for annexation again much stronger. And when we enter that territory of annexation, it completely changes the game. If you annex territory, it changes the nature of the state. If you push Palestinian populations out of the West Bank into territories like Jordan, it challenges the geopolitical stability of the region. It throws away a peace agreement with the Jordanians. So it starts to set up a whole other context for a much more brutal conflict in that region if we're starting to walk down this road of annexation via setting up the sort of urban conditions of settlement expansion. So that's the one thing I would add.
Yeah, really excellent point.
Yeah, great points all around. Thank you both so much for your spiels and answering my questions. And does anyone have questions? I'm sure. Yeah.
At the front.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. Really appreciate the talk and the conversation. The information was fantastic. My question is about Jerusalem. I feel like Jerusalem is the most important issue in the conflict, and especially when it comes to urban design. Jerusalem's undergone a lot of development, a lot of reconstruction and infrastructure development in the last couple of years. And one thing I found really interesting when I was in Jerusalem in 2018 was there's the new streetcar line, the light rail, which goes from the western half of Jerusalem all the way to the settlement in the north, I think close to Pisgat Ze'ev, as Kyle was talking about before. But one thing I found interesting was that the light rail has a stop in Shuafat, which is a Palestinian refugee camp in the municipality of Jerusalem, but the entire station was closed down because there was rioting and there was destruction and there was conflict between the local residents and the light rail operator. So I guess my question is, how do you accommodate for human behavior and, I guess, resistance to the idea of integration when it comes to urban design, specifically in Jerusalem, but also throughout the West Bank?
Yeah, want to take that?
Yeah. Here. There should be a mic that goes around.
Yeah.
That's a really great question. I think, and it was a large focus on during my thesis research, actually, and it's during my research there. It seemed to me that the urban plan of Jerusalem was intentionally conceived of to create these ethnic enclaves, such that if there were moments of uprising from a particular community, it became very easy for the IDF or the military police to respond to that kind of act of unrest. And so you look at how infrastructure is planned, who has access to that infrastructure. Okay, so where is the main highway running in Jerusalem, as an example? That main highway is running along, in large part, along the former Green Line. So it's kind of like re-entrenching these borders within the urban plan of Jerusalem itself. So infrastructure kind of gets used in the Jerusalem context as a way of controlling populations. That's a very helpful thing to have up here. And the real question is, okay, so now that exists, what do you do to change that? If you're going to say that the blending of populations or the dialogue between Israelis and Palestinians is critical to kind of move forward in the peace process, and that polarization on both sides is only going to lead to worsening of the conflict, how do you start to undermine or mitigate that kind of fragmentation of the city, right? And in some ways, that also plays out territorially in the West Bank as well. And I think it's hard to speculate right now on the kind of policy level that would need to be in place to implement that. But at the bare minimum, it's about rethinking, or again, decoupling this idea of infrastructure or of planning logic from a kind of military logic. But it's hard to do that as well, because planning also has embedded within its own discipline a kind of concept of growth management, of risk management, and in some ways these concepts have been applied to a much more severe form of risk, right? So from an Israeli urban planner's perspective, this is a very important thing to consider when we're thinking about the overall function and prosperity of a city like Jerusalem and its safety of its civilians. So I don't know if that kind of answers much of what you were asking specifically about the infrastructure component, but the urban fabric of Jerusalem is so fragmented that it would take, like in experience, that it would take a major intervention to mitigate that.
Other questions?
How do you get over the hostility of one group to the other if, let's say, perhaps recently, young people are put in jail, the houses sometimes destroyed? Are we using too strong a hand to put them down, or are they, acting similarly, to us, so that we have to act as similarly to them? I have found an answer. We know the question, we don't have an answer to it. What is municipality make it easier for them to build houses or for us to build houses? I would like to ask something that we look for in the future. What would be the future for our children, for our grandchildren, if they want to live in Israel?
I could try to answer that question. I think it's a very difficult one. I don't have a exact plan or outline, but I think at a bare minimum, what you're referencing is the kind of practice of removing Palestinians from their homes because of building code violations, or because they're building under some illegal zoning bylaw, and then they go and they take them and they knock down their houses to make more room for other Israeli communities, Jewish communities. And at the bare minimum, I mean, if, as Alex kind of mentioned earlier, if Israel is going to exert its sovereignty over East Jerusalem, they have to be willing to govern it with the complexities of having a Palestinian population enmeshed within the Jewish capital, right? That means you can't treat those populations differently than Jewish Israeli populations. I'd like to believe that that is possible. I think a major answer to getting there is creating opportunities for as much as possible, and this seems very difficult in today's world, but creating opportunities as much as possible to have dialogue across that borderline, right? So you don't have generations of Palestinians that grow up never interacting with an Israeli, and vice versa, and that becomes. And it's difficult for me to even say that in today's context, just given what's happened in the recent year and a bit. But if there's going to be any hope for people to live in Jerusalem in peace, I think we have to start with creating the conditions where people feel like they can belong fundamentally, that they're not going to be kicked out, their communities aren't going to be destroyed or annexed under the pretense of security, etc. So it's not a very satisfying answer. There's nothing specific. No Kyle Brill's 10 points to ending the conflict in the Middle East, but I think that's a starting point.
Can I add something onto that? I also don't have an easy answer, but I do want to add something. I think that, from the Jewish-Israeli perspective, when we're looking at Palestinian society, obviously there's an extremism problem, right? Like Hamas is dominant in large parts of Palestinian society. It's the dominant force on the ground in Gaza. It's very popular in the West Bank. That's why, this whole time I've been like, we need two states, but also it's not possible right now. It's because there isn't an empowered Palestinian partner that recognizes Israel's legitimacy. So there's the school of thought that basically absolves Israel of any sort of responsibility to consider Palestinian national interests when it comes to dictating the future of this region. And there's also the school of thought that Israel doesn't have a choice but to consider Palestinian national interests, given that there are two national groups and neither is going anywhere. And it's an existential necessity that Israel consider Palestinian national interests. So the question is, what Israeli policies can be implemented that, on the one hand, are tough on terrorism and tough on extremism and treat Hamas and Palestinian extremism like the threat that it is, but on the other hand, demonstrate to the Palestinian people that there is another way, that Israel actually ultimately is willing to cede a large part of the historic Jewish homeland to the Palestinians. And that is the only way that you are going to actually reduce support for Hamas among Palestinians. Now, there will always be ideological crazes on both sides. There will always be Palestinians who support Hamas. This is, Islamism is a deeply rooted religious belief in Palestine, large swaths of Palestinian society that isn't swayed by material concerns. People often point to the fact that, under left-wing governments in Israel, there were more terror attacks, or the Oslo Accords prompted more terror attacks. All of this is true. Israeli policy alone isn't going to fix extremism in Palestinian society. But, the reason why most Palestinians support the idea of muqawama, or violent resistance, as a way of advancing their national interests is because they believe that negotiations won't work, that Israelis don't want peace. So there has to be some sort of other thing that Palestinians can look to as a way of tangibly advancing their national interests if we're going to see that extremism defeated. And, I'll just say on the Miri side, Samir Senejlawi, who's a Palestinian analyst who we've met with at Israel Policy Forum before, he was on our podcast about a year ago, and he talked about the need on the Palestinian side not to defeat the Israelis, but to defeat the fear of the Israelis, to defeat the idea that the Palestinian national collective is an existential threat to Zionism and to the Israelis. And I think that's really how we should be thinking about it.
Does that answer, sort of? Yes?
There's no answer to all of them. They're cold, right?
Yeah. It's the best we can do.
Exactly.
When you were in Israel, I'm sure you came across many young that and similarly young Israelis. My question is, what did they think of each other? What were their sentiments?
It's a really good question. I think I did encounter Israelis and Palestinians during my research. I think specifically I'll answer that in the context of Jerusalem, where there are Palestinian ethnic communities in the valleys typically, and Jewish Israeli communities on the hilltops, kind of like the West Bank. And what I will say is that when speaking to both groups, there's a general sense of mistrust of the other. And they occupy quite literally just different strata of society. And when I say literally, I mean like topographically different areas in the city, like the valleys versus the hills. I keep mentioning that because experientially, it's actually very significant. If you wander into certain communities in East Jerusalem, you don't really feel like you're in Jerusalem anymore. You feel like you're in a Palestinian village. They literally quite live very distinctly from each other. And I think generations of mistrust and tragedy on both sides of this conflict really influence their perceptions of each other, and they don't venture into their other communities as often as they may want to, both because of security reasons and police presence in Israeli communities, and also just for general bodily harm considerations. And if you're an Israeli and a Palestinian community, there's such a deep sense of mistrust between both groups that they don't really have much good to say about each other ever, and that's only within Jerusalem itself. Again, but there are obviously exceptions to that rule. I think where I saw the most, I'd say, mixing of the groups was around the old city, specifically kind of the periphery around it, not within the old city, but in the sort of park that's been kind of created around the exterior of the old city. And in Jerusalem, there's this really interesting habit of finding as much shade as you possibly can, and that's kind of like the major feature of public space is where can I find some relief from the sun. And when you find those places, you see people interacting, but not very, I'd say, robustly. There's just deep mistrust. You walk around different areas, the signage turns from Hebrew to Arabic. On just if you cross a street, there's historic communities that are sort of layered into this unified sort of urban fabric of Jerusalem. And so that kind of structure to the city doesn't necessarily lend itself well to having a population that's comfortable mixing with each other, especially under these circumstances. So it's not a very satisfying answer, but...
Read his thesis. You probably already have. Yes, a red shirt in the back.
Oh.
Yeah.
What do you think the Canadian Jewish community ignores or gets wrong in discussions of Jerusalem and the West?
I'm not Canadian, so I can't really speak to that. I can give you the answer for the U.S. Jewish community.
Start there, yeah.
So the question is, what does the North American Jewish community get wrong in its discussions about East Jerusalem and the West Bank?
Yeah, like I would say
Overlook and ignore. Okay, so for East Jerusalem, I think that most people don't know this map. And I'm not saying that everyone should know this map, but the problem is that most people, most diaspora Jews, most North American Jews, when we go to Jerusalem, we stay in West Jerusalem. All of our friends and family in Jerusalem, most of them live in West Jerusalem, or they live in East Jerusalem neighborhoods in the light blue over there that you go into them and they feel like, West Jerusalem because they're Israeli neighborhoods in Jerusalem. And, you go to the Old City, which is technically within East Jerusalem, but you go to the Jewish quarter and you don't experience the Palestinian side at all. You don't, what Kyle was saying about the fact that the Palestinian neighborhoods in East Jerusalem feel different. Like you feel like you're in a different city. I can speak firsthand to that. I this summer was did a tour of one of the Palestinian neighborhoods in East Jerusalem. It feels completely different. It feels like you're in a different city. It feels like you're in Palestine. Like it really does feel like a different country, and that goes for the Palestinian cities in the West Bank as well. Plenty of diaspora Jews are very familiar with West Bank settlements. A lot of them, a lot of us have friends and family who live in the settlements. These are not evil places with evil people. These are, communities filled with normal Israelis by and large. And we know them very well. And, if your entire experience of the West Bank or if East Jerusalem is in settlements or in Israeli communities, then it makes sense why you don't understand the fact that there is this complex geopolitical reality going on where when as I said earlier, when you walk into Ramallah, you don't feel like you're in Israel. I went to Ramallah for the first time and I had this realization, this very eerie feeling of I'm in the land of Israel, I'm in territory controlled by Israel, and yet I feel like a total foreigner. I went to Ramallah by myself for the first time, obviously hiding the fact that I'm Jewish, just there under the guise of being like a, curious American. But it's a reality that really hits you when you go into these communities, and I think that is the thing that is misunderstood, and the fact that reality isn't going to go away for the foreseeable future without some sort of crazy changes on the ground. There really are two different peoples layered on top of each other.
What I'd add to that, it's not so specific to Canadians or Americans per se, but what I will add to that is that every single line on a map, every single brick and every foundation wall, everything in this context is layered with political problems and complexity. And it's very easy to draw lines on a map, and we might have, a tendency to kind of think that way in the West. Diplomatic processes produce, we produce tons of maps of the West Bank, tons of maps of Jerusalem, and the fact remains that regardless of where your house fell in relation to a borderline conceived by somebody outside of your world, you still have a kind of visceral idea of that belonging to you or that being your home. And I think it's important for us to remember these are, no matter how radicalized some may be on both sides, these are still, large part, these settlements are domestic environments. They're places where people are living, where they seek to create a future for themselves, for their families. And it's very easy to treat populations as statistics or as numbers in a spreadsheet. But it's important for us to remember the human dimension of all of this on both sides of the line.
Yeah, excellent point.
I think we have time for like one, maybe two more because we started a bit late.
So it kind of seems like Israel's kind of like at the crossroads moving towards annexation. And it seems the government leaning towards that way and they make that put it mildly. But I'm curious to how how Israelis think that they agree that the current government that annexation we're moving forward is the right way to go, or are they also or do they agree that goes against?
I'll briefly say I think it really depends on which Israeli you ask. That's the simple answer. Whether you're not you're a religious Zionist, whether you're still somehow part of the Israeli left, which has been largely eviscerated since October 7th. But there are still people in Israel who believe in this concept of two states, of civil separation and military control, or kind of military oversight or security oversight as a means to kind of move towards a two-state outcome. I don't know how big of a group they are, but I know that the voices around annexation are getting louder. Far-right parties are gaining more influence over political discourse. But the simple answer is it really just depends on who you ask. And I think Alex will have a lot more to say on that.
Yeah, I can definitely speak to that. I think everything you said is correct. But by and large, when you're looking at the trends in Israeli society and how people are viewing these issues, on the one hand, obviously since October 7th, Israeli society has gone to the right. And the idea of ceding any territory to the Palestinians is viewed by a vast majority of Israeli Jews as ridiculous and is not something that is feasible. And I understand why. By and large, that consideration, though, is driven by security concerns and not by ideology. And I think that's important to emphasize. Israelis don't believe in two states by and large. Again, we're talking in generalizations. I'm talking about, a majority of Israelis do not support two states, not because they believe in this, they have a deep, ideological conviction for settling the land or for having Jewish sovereignty throughout the territory, but rather because they rightly identify the fact that there's no Palestinian partner, which is why, when it's framed as I said earlier, not as two states, yes or no, but annexation versus separation, the picture looks very different. Israelis, by and large, know that annexation is something that would pose an existential threat to Israel's character as Jewish and democratic. It's not something that is talked about very widely in the discourse, but if you go back to 2020, which again, before October 7th, so take it with a grain of salt, but when normalization with the United Arab Emirates happened, one thing that is often overlooked is the fact that what enabled Israel-UAE normalization to occur was Israel foregoing its intention to annex parts of the West Bank. And that was a very popular move across Israeli society. Israelis, by and large, preferred normalization over annexation. And I think that by and large, and again, we're not talking about all Israelis. A lot of Israelis have different considerations. A lot of Israeli Jews don't care about democracy, which is fine, but it's that's the reality. I mean, a lot, especially more religious Israelis who care more about other factors, like democracy is not a priority. But for Israelis for whom democracy is a priority, which is still a large number of Israeli Jews, annexation threatens that priority, and I think that when it's framed as annexation versus separation, and Israelis understand that that separation is not something that will compromise security, but would rather advance their security, then the picture begins to look a little bit different. And I don't have specific studies like off the top of my head to point to, but this is by and large consistent with what I've seen over the past couple of years.
I just want to add one more thing to that. This notion that there's no credible partner in the Palestinian side of the equation for Israel to work with on these issues is really important. And we have to remember like why that is. So the real question is, what can we do to create such a condition that a viable Palestinian partner does emerge from within the Palestinian political process, right? How is that even possible? I mean, that's the question that's hovering over all of this, right? Because Israelis' opinions are largely dictated by that simple fact. There isn't a good faith partner on the other side of the table to work with. So questions of annexation or not, or two states, democracy, all these things, it boils down to kind of the practical reality of, well, there's no one there that I can work with to secure my interests.
Yes. Last question.
When there's these discussions around partition between the West and Palestine, are there in your research studies like that, are there any lessons you've found where it has been done, like separate
I mean, yeah. There's good examples of cities that used to be divided that reintegrate. Belfast is an interesting example, although it's not perfectly done. I think it's a temptation to look at other contexts and say, oh, there was some kind of conflict here. There's communities that are living on two sides of a borderline, or they have some kind of dispute. There's a reason why those conflicts aren't the center of international media attention most of the time, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is. There's something about this context that it's the center of a lot of people's imagination, whether from a religious perspective, a political perspective. Everybody seems to have an opinion on this place, and this small little piece of land in the Middle East. And I think that adds a whole other layer to the question. So if it's about applying a model from somewhere else onto this one, what I learned quite quickly is that that's just sort of a moot exercise, because a lot of these considerations are so contextually ingrained, and things as simple again as topography. Like Belfast is a predominantly flat terrain. Jerusalem is not. There's really banal, very, again, unsexy things about how cities are built that dictate how this could work or not. And I would just say that we have to be very careful of applying models from other places onto this one as a means of understanding a possible route forward.
Thank you, Kyle. Thank you, Alex. This was really amazing, very enlightening. I have a lot of follow-up questions. I'm sure other people do too. It's left us all with much to ponder. So thanks everyone for coming. I appreciate it. And a very quick plug for IPF, Israel Policy Forum, and IPF Atid. I'm just going to read this date because I always forget, but April 24th, IPF Atid is collaborating with UJA on an event. We're bringing Dalia Ziada virtually to speak with us as she will share her journey from Egypt to North America and her insights into the modern Middle East, the role of media in shaping conflicts, and assess Egypt's regional influence. It'll be very interesting, so if you would like to check that out, you can look at UJA's events, or if you're a young professional, maybe you can look via IPF Atid. Many thanks again for coming, and
thank you all.
good night.
Thanks so much, Miri.